Okay, that's for all you rock and roll fans. This is chapter 28, The Affluent Society. Okay, so our usual roadmap, I've replaced it here to help you better understand the chapter. Couple things here. Domestic, I think it breaks down to two. It's middle class America versus the discontents. So the African Americans beats nonconformists. And then for foreign policy, you have anti-communist versus the limits of anti-communist policy. Okay, so starting domestically, the sources of economic growth. Well, the period after World War II, really from 1945 to 1973, is the one of the best periods of economic expansion in American history. Part of that question is why. So one, you have government spending. You have government spending on schools, including the GI Bill that we talked about the last unit. You have also the government spending on GI Bill and their ability to buy homes and buy farms and start up businesses. Also, you have the government building highways, which we'll talk about later in the chapter. In addition to that, you have the government spending on the military. So the military sees a dramatic growth during this time period, all contributes to that economic growth. Additionally, you have suburban growth, so fueled by the highways, fueled by people buying their own homes. That helps additionally, and just like we have to the picture to the right, we have the baby boom. Okay, and so baby birth had been declining during the Great Depression, had an uptick during World War II, and that continues on after World War II. And of course, why do babies matter? Because when you have babies, you need to buy diapers, you need to buy clothes, you need to buy food, all these things. And as that cohort grows up, that will stimulate demand in all those areas, other areas. So when they're teenagers, they will also demand jeans and rock and roll. And then when they're older, they'll demand cars. And so that group, because it's such a large number, will always demand more. So currently the baby boomers are beginning to retire. Well, they have started retirement, so that will also stimulate an increase in demand for Social Security. Okay, here's a graph showing the exact size of the baby boom. Okay, so what we have is we have the rise of the modern West. So why does the West grow so much? They have a favorable climate, but additionally during World War II, if you remember, there was a lot of, well, I don't know if you remember, there was a lot of contracts that built military weapons and military equipment out west. The dams during the New Deal helped stimulate settlement, the automobile growth, and so the oil discovered out west helps fuel further settlement of the West, and they have a great university system. Okay, going on to the new economics. Keynesian economics is actually something. John Maynard Keynes was actually a British economist that gave advice to first FDR. And Keynesian economics says you have to spend during economic decline in order to get out. So that's the whole New Deal and the hundreds of millions of dollars spent during the New Deal in order to try to get out. The more millions and millions of dollars spent during World War II to get out, that helps end poverty through economic growth. And Keynes kind of runs contrary to the economic thought of the day that government needs a balanced budget. Keynes has always said the government has a primary role of spending money during economic decline. Okay, and so that the government also has a role in managing the economy. That is the government's job. Okay, and this becomes so pervasive. So by 1970s, Richard Nixon, who's a Republican, makes this famous quip that we're all Keynesians now. So both Democrats and Republicans both support the idea of Keynes. Okay, and so what this is supposed to be, and I think this is actually a little bit premature, or actually this goes with the last slide. So how do you end how do you end poverty? And so the traditional view is that you end poverty by taking from the rich and giving to the poor. So if this is the economic pie, quite literally up top, the top 10% have this much, it stands to reason that if you want people, the other 90% to have more pie, they need to take it from the rich. And Keynes and others said, instead of taking from the rich and giving to the poor, what if we grew the pie so it was larger? So now we have a larger economic pie. The top 10% could have literally the same amount. And the question is, does that bottom 90% have more pie? In a very real sense, the answer is yes, they do have more pie. Now, they still have less pie than the rich, but they have more um, literally amongst themselves. Okay, so the answer became not in terms of ending poverty, not taking from the rich, giving to the poor. It came in the terms of let's build a bigger economic pie. Okay, so what does that mean for labor unions and capital? One, you have a rise in corporate consolidation, so you have the disappearance of the smaller businesses, smaller mom and pop farms, and a tendency towards larger companies, larger farms. The post-war contract is the contract with labor unions, obviously, and the owners. There is generous increase in wages, and because there's an increase in wages, they kind of had this understanding that unions wouldn't contest the workplace and other issues like that, aside from wages. AFL and CIO merged together, and so during this whole time, it's kind of the rise of big labor, and because of big labor, there's very few strikes. It's kind of a good time for everybody, except for the unorganized workers. Okay, here's union growth actually kind of peaks in the it does peak in the 1980s, probably less so because of the rules, but more so because of the factory works that tends to show up in unions. Those factories tend to begin to disappear by the 1980s. They either get sent overseas or replaced by technology, and therefore you have a disappearance of unions. Okay, medical breakthroughs, and so antibiotics play a big role, and so they discover, they commercialized antibiotics and penicillin. So they actually discovered it before World War II, but they're able to now commercialize it. That's a big important idea. So mass produce and commercialize penicillin. I mean, so much so that when you are prescribed penicillin by your doctor, you can actually go to a place like Myers and they will give it to you for free because it's so cheap. There's also medical breakthroughs in terms of vaccines and treating viruses. So Jonas Salk is able to develop a vaccine for the polio virus. Okay, and that is a big breakthrough against diseases. Science also gives us pesticides, so we're able to kill the insects. And so DDT is a popular insecticide until they find out that DDT is not just killing the insects, but also killing wildlife such as birds. And so in the 1970s, actually, we will get the rise of the environmental movement. And the book that kicked off the environmental movement was Rachel Carson's The Silent Spring. Okay, so think about it. Why is it titled The Silent Spring? It's because all the birds are dead. So if you take a look at the picture at the right here, you see these kids. You know, this is modern science, and so this is how you used to do insect control, mosquito control, and you see these kids are about to walk through the cloud-making machine, also known as DDT. Here is your shout out to all you STEM kids. So the first computers were born back then. Obviously, they won't become popularized till much later. Also, we get TV. Okay, more science and technology. So we have the explosion of the hydrogen bomb, which is more powerful than the the atomic bomb that was used during World War II. So now the thought of war and the threat of war has become much more deadly. There really is a race for the ICBM, the Intercontinental Ballistic Missile. Okay, and so they're trying to develop the fuel and the guidance systems, and later actually to be able to shoot it out of submarines. And so just to give you a sense of this, this is kind of the challenge that North Korea is going through. I think they have developed the ICBM now. So it's one thing to develop nuclear weapons. It's another to be able to equip it onto a missile and shoot it long distances. Okay, the science and technology also give us the space program. The shock of Sputnik. Sputnik was the Russian satellite here that was launched into space in 1957, and that was a shock to Americans that we have fallen behind in the space race, and that if the Soviets can get into space, then they must be further ahead, and our very existence is doomed. And so what that does is it triggers a rise in science education in schools that we need. There's this need to catch up. So not only is the space race important for weapons, but also important for prestige. Again, so the Cold War is much about us versus them and who's better than anything else. If any of you guys have seen the movie Hidden Figures, that does a great job in terms of women's contribution and African American women's contribution in particular to getting to outer space. Okay, so now this the People Plenty slides really talks about the rise of the middle class. Okay, and so we get a consumer culture. So similar to what you saw in the 1920s with movies, radio, automobiles, advertising, we have the same thing here in the 1950s. Okay, so that there are consumer crazes that pop up, the hula hoop, Disney, and a lot of this is driven by just the increase in wealth. There's more money. People have more money. They want more variety, more availability. Advertising helps fuel this, such as this lady's refrigerator, which you can see is stocked literally from wall to wall. Okay, and that creates a sense of norm that, hey, if this lady has it, everybody should have something like that. And so with the credit card and payment plans, it makes it easier for everybody to live a lifestyle really probably beyond their means. Okay, People Plenty, what also drives this is the interstate highways. Okay, interstate highways is actually enabled by the 1956 Highway Act under Dwight D. Eisenhower. Okay, and so this was made to be able, the highways were intended to be able to ship goods around the country faster, move troops around the country faster. Again, this is during the Cold War. What this really did, it had a couple effects. It facilitated the growth of the suburbs. So if you think about it, many of you, your parents probably work in the cities or work in a city different from Plymouth or Canton. What allows them to live in Plymouth, Canton and work elsewhere? It's the highway. Okay, so this also accelerated the decline of the cities, and the decline of the cities and in the suburbs. Of course, you guys know what that's like. So we have bigger homes, bigger garages, we can barbecue. Um, all those things are enabled by the interstate highways. And so part of suburbia that grows up, what stereotypically is called Levittown. And Levittown is what you see in the two pictures. They're cookie cutter homes, so they're exactly the same. Uh, Little front yard, a big window in the living room. They sold for about $10,000, and they were all identical. So if any of you guys have been around Cherry Hill Village, I imagine it's somewhat like that, although those homes have different colors. Levittowns enabled people to move out of their parents' house. And so prior to this, you probably lived in your parents' house and shared space with them until you're much older, until you can afford a house. Now the homes are affordable. You can get your own house, have your own little yard, and it's a win-win. And this is one of the things that helps drive the economic boom at that. So for the prevailing family, and we mentioned this a little bit in the last lecture, that women were encouraged to stay home. So during World War II, women were encouraged to work. Rosie the Riveter, we can do it. Now it is more about, hey, stay at home, be a good mom, be a good housewife. And what helps reinforce this idea, it's TV helps reinforce it. We'll come up to that in the next slide. But also, it really is it's a sign of prosperity. Okay, so if your husband makes enough money so the wife can stay home, you guys must be successful. And if the wife works, it's really an indictment of the man and his ability to bring home the bagels there. In reality, what happened was more married women worked. Up to a third of them worked because to maintain the lifestyle that we think everybody else has, you need a dual income household. Okay, and then 1970s that really takes off. Dr. Benjamin Spock, the new child raising guru. He is an advocate for the uh, child-centered education and rearing. And so what that means is the needs of the child outweigh the physical and emotional needs of the parents. Okay, and then as you can guess, it probably creates some spoiled children. Okay, so sticking with People of Plenty in the middle class here, you get the birth of television, the social consequence of television. So TV becomes as the most powerful influence on American culture, more so now than radio and movies. And because of TV, essentially it becomes a vehicle for advertising. We need to sell things, and that's why we produce these shows. But really, probably more so, it has this homogenizing message. Homogenizing means making the same. Okay, and so what is the message that's produced by that's given off by a lot of these TV shows? It's that, hey, for middle class families, this is what the typical middle class family is. Here to the right, we have the Leave It to Beaver show. And so you have dad that goes off to work every day, works in a corporation. You have mom, who's the stay-at-home. You have two rascally kids that are kind of troublemakers, but not that much trouble, just more like, riding across somebody's lawn type trouble. Okay, and that becomes a definite sign of middle class and what people aspire to. Here some weird, I guess we have enough money so we can go outside and enjoy nature. And this is so a picture, and well, this will come up in another chapter. Chicago and the suburbs. So you have the growth of suburban Chicago outside the main city the main downtown of the city. Okay, and accompanying that, then you have what we call redlining, where African Americans are unable to get loans outside the red lines drawn on these maps, which then, of course, creates segregation. And this is in Chicago, not in the South. Okay, also growth of specialized education. There's been numerous educational reforms trying to get kids interested in school. Now we have a trend. This is really a separating of education. So we have the growth of AP courses, um, honors courses, math and science courses, again, to keep up in the space race. And so it's not so bad then. It's probably been accelerated in the last 10 years here or so. Okay, the middle class that we just discussed, again, was all fueled kind of by the baby boom, TV and its homogenizing effects, Levittown, consumerism, advertising, and all of that kind of created this, what we perceive as the middle class and, the age of conformity here in the 1950s. Was it all true? Not necessarily. So you have a group of people, the Beats, that went against that, and their critique here of that lifestyle that is shallow. So if you remember kind of the Lost Generation's critique during the 1920s, it's similar. So it's shallow, it's meaningless. Where the term the beat comes from, there was a crossover. So black hipsters in the 1920s that developed their own language, their own dress, their own way of living. They crossed over with some of the 1950s beats, and when somebody asked them, said, "How do you feel, man?" And he said, "I'm just beat." Okay, they're just kind of worn out. So that is one descent from the middle class. Another one is rock and roll and Elvis Presley. And so this is Elvis Presley. He is criticized because he really took black music and popularized it because he's a white man doing black music as opposed to a black man doing black music. The other thing that made Elvis scandalous was his dancing, and so his gyrating of hips you can't see because my little cam is in front of it, but the gyrating of hips and the perverse movements, that shocked a lot of parents, and because that shocks parents, probably kids wanted more of that. Okay, so other people that did not fit in the stereotypical middle class, you have the affluent society, and so there are a number of poor people, probably up to a fifth of this country lives in poverty. How do we know that? Michael Harrington's The Other America, the book that talked about what those people live like. And so if you remember during the Gilded Age, How the Other Half Lives, Jacob Riis, this is kind of the same thing. So The Other America kind of documents how poor people live in this country and how many poor people there are here. And so in particular, the rural poverty that's out of sight, out of mind, much of which we don't see, but it's certainly as persistent. Okay, the inner cities, and so you have black urban migration in terms of whites are moving out of the cities, begins moving out of the cities again with the suburbs. Blacks can begin moving in, and so we have this contrast um, of middle class African Americans that are doing well in the cities. Hispanics come in. Um, versus the culture of poverty that exists in parts of the inner city. Okay, so we have this kind of twin forces operating in the inner cities. Okay, and the other dissent that we don't often think of it this way, but how you should think about it is the civil rights movement. And so counter to the middle class, rising middle class in the 1950s, and you should read in that white middle class, here we have the civil rights movement. And so the Brown versus Board decision, 1954, desegregated schools. Okay, so if you talk about Brown, you need to talk about it in contrast to Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896. Remember, Plessy versus Ferguson legalized segregation, first in the train cars, but then elsewhere. The Brown decision makes segregation illegal, and first in schools, but then elsewhere. Okay. And it created the separate but equal doctrine. And the separate but equal doctrine is a sense saying that whenever you have separate facilities, that makes it illegal. And there's a famous Dow study that goes with this. Kenneth Clark, the sociologist, when he asked children, like when he asked white children, which Dow is the good Dow, the white Dow or the black Dow, they pointed to the white Dow. When they said, which one is the bad Dow, they pointed to the black Dow. And when they asked little black children the same thing, which one is the good Dow, they pointed to the white Dow. And when they asked which one is the bad Dow, they pointed to the black Dow. And so the conclusion was that by having separate facilities that inherently is unequal, creates a sense of inferiority among the students, and that's illegal. So massive resistance is the South's response to Brown versus Board. Okay, and they're going to practice this policy called interposition. And so interposition is essentially the Southern government is going to put itself between the federal government and African Americans. Okay, and so if you think about this, this is a lot like the whole nullification crisis. So if the South doesn't agree with a law, or in this case, the Supreme Court decision, can they just resist it and not follow? Okay, and so that's going to set up a showdown. First showdown here is in Little Rock, Arkansas, in 1957. So this is 3 years after Brown versus Board. Little Rock Central High School still won't allow African American students, and when they finally do, there's no police protection and there's a near riot. And Eisenhower says this is flying in the face of the federal government and the Supreme Court decision because that has the immediate force of law. He sends down the 101st Airborne to give a military escort to these 9 black children that are going to attend Little Rock Central High School. And so that year, the students have a military escort throughout the entire school year, and they graduate their first African American student. And then the following year, Governor Faubus closes it down. Okay, continue with the civil rights movement. So the Montgomery bus boycott in 1954. This I think you guys know about. Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on the bus. And then, you guys, this is all planned strategy. So I think many Americans tend to think that it was some spontaneous protest, that she was tired and that she just didn't want to give up her seat that day. This had been kind of planned out. In fact, I think she had been arrested before. But Rosa Parks was an active member of the NAACP in Alabama. And actually, before she got arrested, about a week before, there's a pregnant African American teenager that was arrested. But they didn't launch the bus boycott based off that arrest because the optics of it, because she was a teenager, because she was pregnant. They didn't want that to be the case, so they waited for Rosa Parks, an upstanding citizen, to be arrested, and they launched this bus boycott. And so African Americans would walk to work, and in particular, what this did was they forced white homeowners to decide, like, do they want their domestic workers? A lot of times, African American women. So do they want their homes clean? Do they want their laundry done, or do they want to support segregation? And so secretly, some of the women picked up their domestic help. They organized carpools, or they just walked. And eventually, the segregated buses was declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. And Martin Luther King's strategy, I think you guys probably know this by well, is this idea that that they should practice nonviolence. So civil rights protesters should practice nonviolence, because if you hit back, you're going to leave it up to the witnesses and everyone to decide, like, who's right and who's wrong. If one side is nonviolent and the other side is violent, it becomes morally more clear who's right and who's wrong. Okay, so why did civil rights movement pop up now and at this time? And actually, if you've been listening closely throughout the school year, you know that there's been several, numerous protests throughout history. But why was this one more successful? One, it's the legacy of World War II. So I think in some of my classes I've mentioned the Double V campaign. And so African American soldiers that are going to fight, they want victory abroad, victory at home. Okay, and it's not lost on Americans, all Americans, that we are fighting a war for democracy, that Hitler's fascist ideas and the ideas of a master race are ludicrous. But it's hard to believe that the idea of a master race is dumb overseas, but then to come home and live in and have segregation and Jim Crow among us. You have a growing black urban middle class that is able to fuel not only or to fund the intellectual, but also the financial backbone of the protests. You have TV, which is big, and we'll talk about this in class next week, but TV provides the images. Okay, so it's one thing to hear about, to read about it in a newspaper. It's another thing to see it with your own eyes. Um, Also, the Cold War context. And so, again, Cold War, we are arguing that democracy is a superior form of government versus communism. We treat our citizens better. That is hard to make that argument when you see images like on the right, where you have the firemen um, shooting water hoses at civil rights protesters. Okay, and lastly, just education, that more people have access to quality education, and it's harder to hold on to those beliefs. Okay, so Eisenhower, Republican. Eisenhower, if you remember from the last chapter, Eisenhower, well, maybe not. Eisenhower's a moderate. Okay, he is not a hardcore conservative. In fact, the Democrats again try to get him to run for president as a Democrat in 1948. And so the new outlook under Eisenhower is that, again, even though he's a Republican, he's accepted Keynesian economics. This idea of also limited government, and that they're going to encourage private investment. One thing Eisenhower did do was he did cut farm price supports, farm price subsidies, and so they're kind of on their own there. He doesn't undo the welfare state, okay? And so a lot of those New Deal programs that came up and that survived, like Social Security, that was still here, okay? And so he didn't do away with it. And again, that had just kind of come to be accepted by most Americans. We talked about the Federal Highway Act of 1956 in terms of growth of the suburbs and fueling the economic expansion. McCarthyism, they insert this here. McCarthyism, if you remember in some of my classes, what spelled the end of McCarthy was that he accused the army of having communism. So first, remember, his accusations were against the State Department. Everybody was afraid to take him on because if you question whether he had the names of known communists, you'd be sus yourself. Now he accuses the army of having communists, and they televised these Army McCarthy hearings. And Joseph Welch, Army lawyer for the Army, calls out McCarthy. His famous line is, "Have you no sense of decency, sir?" Everybody sees what a bully McCarthy is, and they kind of come to their senses. So McCarthy's censured by the Senate and dies a couple years later of liver failure because he's an alcoholic. Okay, so Dulles and massive retaliation. What happens is the Truman Doctrine and the policy of containment, where we are going to fight communism all over, becomes very expensive. And so what we do is we adopt this policy of massive retaliation, which means we are going to blow you up. Okay, and so now we're going to stockpile nuclear weapons, which is cheaper than maintaining an army and supporting maintaining a large army in times of peace and fighting wars around the globe. Now we're just going to have nuclear weapons, and so we're going to blow you up, which sounds great, but there are limits on using nuclear weapons. Okay, and so one of the limits becomes apparent after World War II. All countries are supposed to give up their colonies. Okay, and so France didn't want to give up Vietnam. Vietnam was one of their colonies. They didn't want to give them up, so they tried to reestablish control afterwards. Vietnam under Ho Chi Minh beat back the French. They actually beat them back to Dien Bien Phu. America had been giving the French a couple billion dollars to support their effort. Despite all that, they are still beaten back. They ask America for a nuclear weapon, if they can use one of our nuclear weapons. Eisenhower says no. The Vietnamese chase the French out, and they are able to win their independence. So other Cold War crises, and again, this is part of that anti-communism that I drew up for you in the roadmap. One, we recognize Israel, part of our Middle East policy. And why do we need this? Is because in the Cold War, again, it's you and your friends versus the Soviets and their friends. You need a friend in the Middle East. And so we recognize Israel, and we've become actually, I think, their largest supporter still today in terms of foreign aid and military support. The Suez crisis in Egypt, and the short version of this, Suez crisis in Egypt. The Egyptians want money they want money to build the dam, the Aswan Dam. British and U.S. refused to loan them money, so Egypt is angry. They will buy weapons from the Soviets. In addition to that, they will nationalize the Suez Canal. Suez Canal is a major canal. They take control back over it. Israel and Great Britain invade Egypt, and so Egypt's fighting them. Soviets jump in and they threaten on the side of Egypt, and they threaten to use nuclear weapons. We bring them back down, and but that is another one of those close calls. And so we still have these flare-ups in the Cold War. Fidel Castro has a communist overthrow of Batista in Cuba in 1959. Again, part of the overthrow is that there's a lot of Americans and Cubans, a lot of Cubans that feel Americans have taken advantage of Cuba. They own the property, they own the farms, and the average Cuban person is locked out. So Fidel Castro, who's a general in the army, overthrows Batista. And the U.S.'s response is to cut diplomatic relations. And actually, the diplomatic relations are cut all the way up until the Obama presidency. Also in Latin America, we have Guzman, Jacob Arbenz Guzman in Guatemala, and we help overthrow Guzman. And so the message in here during the Cold War is that if you are anti-communist, even if you're a dictator, even if you brutalize your own people, that's okay. You can be our ally. Okay, and so it's not whether you are for human rights and democracy, it's whether you're anti-communist. Okay, so one more limit here on the policy of massive retaliation. The Hungarian revolt, there's actually an uprising in Hungary in 1956 where they overthrow the communists. The Soviets send in tanks to crush the uprising, and the US does nothing. They essentially let the Soviet Union go in there and crush the revolution. And that again shows the limits of massive retaliation as your foreign policy. There's no room for in between. Okay, so either you're going to use nuclear weapons or you're not. And I think Eisenhower probably correctly rationalized that it's not worth it to start World War III over Hungary. Okay, bad for them, but probably the right call. So what we have towards the end of Eisenhower's presidency, he's actually reelected in 1956. There is the spirit of Geneva. So who's really worried about this Cold War mentality? It's Europe, because they're going to get hit first by the Soviets, and so they want us to thaw tensions between the two sides. And during this thawing of tensions, this is when Khrushchev comes to America. If you remember from the last video, this is when he wanted to see Disneyland, but they wouldn't let him, and he accused us of hiding their nuclear weapons there. We actually send Richard Nixon over to Moscow. He has a semi-friendly debate with Khrushchev. It's called the kitchen debate, where they're trapped in this model kitchen at this expo center. And so everything is going well until they shoot down a U-2 spy plane. And so we've been flying these U-2 spy plane missions over the Soviet Union. They shoot down one of the planes, and they accuse us of spying on them. Eisenhower says, no, it's just a weather plane. And then they drag out the pilot, Francis Gary Powers, who was supposed to have committed suicide. But I think he had a poison pin that he was supposed to poke himself with, but he doesn't do that. Big embarrassment, and that kind of kills the spirit of Geneva. So that's the U-2 crisis, not to be confused with the other U-2 crisis when Apple put U-2's new album on your iPhone without your permission. Okay, so the last thing before Eisenhower leaves, he warns about the growing influence of the military-industrial complex. Okay, so we have this large permanent military that is there, and because large companies that provide the weapons, the planes, the tanks, the submarines, the missiles for it, that kind of fuels economic development, but also that fuels us to not really look back. And so there's this tie-in between the military and big businesses that provide those weapons. They're scary, and they really have a self-interest at stake. And so Eisenhower, one of his warnings, not unlike Washington's farewell address, where he warned about foreign entanglements and political parties, Eisenhower here warns us about the growing power of the military-industrial complex. Okay, that finishes us up for chapter 28. Hope you enjoyed the lecture. Don't forget to subscribe and to buy the merch.